let's get started.
Okay, great. And I read this book. Well, probably one of the very first books I read about the history of the game, and so much came rushing back to me. So I'm very happy, Jack, that you picked this book.
Good. Okay.
Because it was very enjoyable to read it 20 plus years.
Yeah.
Later.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So the book is Playing for Keeps: A History of Early Baseball by Warren Goldsmith, and it was my copy here. I think it says 1989 on it, and it really is an excellent book. Jack, of course, is one of our now veteran moderators,
Yeah.
and has done a sterling job with so many previous book discussions. So, without further ado, and I'll say more about the book club at the conclusion, what's coming up and so forth.
Right.
But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jack Bales.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you, Peter. This book kind of interested me again. Another way this book interested me is because I had just done for this discussion Peter Morris's book, but didn't we have fun? And so I kind of compare and contrast it with my notes here, and I enjoyed the book too. And Peter said you enjoyed it. I was talking to Bob and Joanne too before we started, but it kind of overwhelmed me at times, and because there was so much there, which is why I sent these discussion topics and questions ahead of time, because maybe you could help get my head wrapped around some of these things in our discussion. So I didn't want to come. I think I can't remember who did this one time before. Someone did this. I thought it turned out real well because we could kind of think about it beforehand. But anyway, the first one, Goldstein writes, by the 1860s, there was much discussion over how much emphasis should be placed on the game itself, like practice, the skillful play, and playing to win, and how much on the whole social side. And that is exercise for fun, the post-game dinners, and the club balls. And I know Peter Morris gets into this too a little bit. And he said, quote, the rights of play extended from the ball field to the ballroom, structuring the life of the baseball club. And he said that with this social side, even extended to the winter months with elaborate dances and balls and things like that. And in fact, even the balls were competitive because players got on the dance floor and tried to outdo each other here. But now in your own baseball reading of your own of contemporary accounts, have you ever crossed discussions of this whole work versus play aspects? Because Goldstein goes into the whole work versus play aspect quite a bit. And I was particularly interested in what he said about the fancy balls and the dinners and the dances in the winter months were held to deliberately structure the life of the baseball player, or were they there to give the players something to do during the off season? And in fact, Peter Morris writes that, quote, many clubs sponsored balls during the off season, sometimes to raise much needed funds, but often just for the enjoyment of renewing friendships. That's kind of where I'm coming from with this, that I personally thought in all my reading that that's what the whole purpose was.
Well, I'd like to just add that when I recollect it, I remember when I first began reading this distinction. Well, I was kind of amazed, at the lengths that some of these clubs would go through to host or an opposing team, and have a banquet after the game and the dance and so forth. They truly were clubs in a sense, in the traditional definition of a club. But it very early on shaped my thoughts about segregation in baseball, because going back a couple of years ago, we had a great discussion, I thought, at the Fred conference on that was led by Bill Rysack on the color lines in baseball. and I was part of a panel for that. The first time I ever participated up there. But one of the points that I tried to make was that this social aspect was no different. I mean, you would not find an integrated socialization such as a dance or a banquet or something like that in 1850s New York or anywhere else probably in the United States.
Mhm.
So I think that that in a way was one of the first steps that kind of, you know, in that direction of having a kind of a segregated game. But anyway, that was, you know, when I reread it now, I thought to myself, yeah, I remember reading that. And I remember that it did begin to fix in my mind that this was one of the 19th century baseball color lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, in the first, I don't know, quarter, third of the book, Goldstein is taking a sociological approach to everything,
Right.
as
Right.
opposed to historical,
Yes.
which he does in the last 2/3
Right.
of the book, going year by year, and here's the big things that happen. And it makes you think that, was there any other way baseball could have evolved except in these very small clubs who played against themselves? And then they played other clubs and they wanted to be good hosts, which was part of the sociology of the at least the semi-moneyed class within the group that had to have enough funds through it. Not because I've been going through some constitutions of pre 1860 clubs. You know, their dues were $5 a year, and they were having to finance things like that. But you also have this suspicion that there was some deep pocket within the club who would drop $100 on them and they could go do something. But this would have to go along because it was a transition with the social side until you got to where it was important who won the game. And when that started to hit, you started to recruit different kinds of players under different circumstances, and clubs became teams and all those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I saw it as an after the fact rationalization of something. I mean, I thought it was an academic sociological piece, as you said, and that probably made more of the transition from play to work than it really deserved. I mean, if you just think about yourselves growing up, you don't start out as a professional baseball player. You play at the game, you play at variations of the game, even as late as the 1960s. When you had fewer than 9 people or fewer than 5 people, you had variations, you had fewer bases, you had various things going on. It was only as you developed the skills to go further that you started thinking about coaches and all that. And I think that's really what happened in the 1850s too. We moved from what was play to something that resembled work. But I don't think anybody sat around in 1850 saying we were going to make this into work. I think it was, sort of post hoc. And that's it.
Yeah. I tend to agree with that because all my reading of contemporary accounts, I never saw some of those things at all. Not one bit.
Well, the other thing is that he wrote this fairly early on in sort of the development of scholarship in baseball, and I don't think he had all that many sources to look at. I mean, when he talks about the people who commented on it, basically he's talking about a couple of people, Chadwick and maybe one other who are the commentators.
Mhm.
Everybody else is sort of, if they're out there, he doesn't find them.
Mhm.
So I thought that was another sort
That's
of
true.
skewing.
There was no
Mhm.
internet in 1989.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So he was, if you want to look at it one way, he was ahead of his time. He was talking about something that nobody else had a lot of scholarship on. And now we're looking at it 20 years later and we're saying, gee, we know a whole bunch more now. We have access to a lot more newspapers and, commentaries from that time.
I think he said he went through the Harry Wright papers.
Yeah.
Yeah, too. Yeah. Remember that. The whole thing about women intrigued me again, because I go back to the Peter Morris book, which I just avidly love. I just think he's practically a Renaissance guy when it comes to baseball. I don't know. I just like all his books. But both Peter Morris and Goldstein say that women were important in baseball because of they would help control the unruly crowds, just having them there in the crowds, and they would cheer on the players. And I know from all my reading of the contemporary accounts, that is exactly true. I'd read that time and time again, as a matter of fact. But then Goldstein also takes it a little bit further when he says that the managers and the clubs wanted women at games as evidence of the game's popularity, and that people would be drawn because the women would make the sport legitimate. And I know I've read bits here and there about making the sport legitimate and getting away from the whole boyish angle to make it more of an adult sport. But has anybody else come across this in your reading though? Because I have never seen that part about making it, that the women would help make it legitimate. That part, I think other things perhaps, but not women.
The idea that if we get more women, it'll calm the crowd down was a bunch of wishful thinking.
Yeah. Okay.
You might keep a subsection of the crowd that way, but you weren't going to take the gamblers out in the left field corner or the guys that were trying to drink whiskey in the bleachers. And you even segregated them. Ballparks were built at least in the 1870s and late 1860s. They would be in different buildings. The grandstands were separated from each other. So you would have the women's grandstand, which you had to have somebody accompany you to get into it. And that may have been the idea, that just their presence would have an effect, but it would only have the effect on the fellow who was accompanying her. I don't think it had anything to do with the guys in the bleachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So much of this book, when I was reading it, I was a member of the young clubs. We had a neighborhood club that we ended up getting a sponsor for a softball team. And we went into this pretty competitive softball league. And so much of what comes out in this book, I kept relating to my softball playing days many years ago. And it's a kind of interesting dynamic because, yeah, we would have parties and dances and so forth, of course, with girlfriends and newly marrieds and so forth. And that was one aspect, but also those same women would come to the games. And being that we were young men,
Mm-hmm.
we would kind of had this little opportunity to kind of, strut our stuff on the field, more to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it was kind of, it's a kind of interesting dynamic. And I think what really begins to happen is that it becomes a chicken and an egg situation. I think that they began to, women probably were coming to the game to see their boyfriends or brothers or whatever play. And then they began to realize that women's presence, made it a more gentlemanly game, or it made it, a better behaved game,
Mhm.
that there were so many women there. So I think that I kept going back to that, those early memories, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the dynamic there.
Mhm.
I'm just trying to think of a Boston game, and if Joanne was there, I'm not sure she would calm the crowd down, and she would be leading the charge
Yeah.
after the umpire.
You're absolutely right. Yes. And yes, women can be pretty violent with their language, especially. But I did find many times mentioned back around 1858, even 59 and 60, at least in the Boston to Worcester area, that they did make mention of women being there. And I do believe that men will be better behaved because it's kind of like the peacock syndrome where you're showing off to the women your virility and all that. It's a way to play out your masculinity. And it's certainly better to do that in front of women than it is in front of a whole bunch of men. And I think that started right back then. And probably the Greeks and the Romans were doing it too. I think everybody knew about it.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Joanne, very
Okay.
much. Uh, I was really interested in what Goldstein said about baseball. Wasn't really that much of a gentleman's sport. He said that the baseball people, quote, upheld an ideal of gentlemanly behavior, but they recognized it as an ideal unlikely to be realized. And he mentioned how the umpire could be, castigated and yelled at, which I think is true from what everything I've read. But Peter Morris quotes Jimmy Wood as saying that the umpires were accorded the most highest respect, given good seats to sit in, and their absolute comfort was uppermost in the minds. While Goldstein notes that they were cool and aloof, and it was understandable that they were sometimes treated with less than absolute respect. And I personally, in my reading, I thought Goldstein was more right, was kind of right on target about this. I didn't really see too much of the being treated with the utmost respect that Jimmy Wood mentions. And of course, Jimmy Wood was a White Stocking, and I read a lot of Jimmy Wood stuff, and I did not see that there. I wonder if, again, anybody else have any thoughts about that?
One thing I,
Go ahead.
Jimmy Wood, was that a contemporary one in the late 1860s, or was that 30 years later?
Oh, the Jimmy Wood I'm thinking of was on the White Stockies back in the very beginning, back in the 1870s. He was their player manager for a while.
Yes, but I mean the quote.
Oh, the quote. Oh, I see what you're talking about. I don't remember what he said in the book about that. Yeah.
Find a reference in the book. I looked.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
It sounds like a middle-aged man's memory of his golden youth.
Well, in fact, Jimmy Wood was quoted in a middle-aged article. In fact, I think John Thorne runs it in one of his columns online. And I read it at the time, and it was just as you said, he was kind of like the reminiscence of a guy in middle age. He did not say anything about umpires in that one. But again, he did get all kind of wistful about it, all the good old days. So that's kind of type of the thing he would say, and I think you got a good point there.
I think if you look in the 1850s, got to remember that most of the games were among themselves, their own clubs.
Yeah.
They were almost intramural, but it was always in the Constitution. They said we're going to pick an umpire as from the membership of the club, so you weren't going to get on the president of the club if it was his turn to umpire or one of those guys. But when you started to get into the situation where you had to get an outsider to be the umpire, and you could
That's right.
question his loyalty to one club or another, that's when the hooting and hollering would start.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I
In
think
fact, you may remember for this group, I gave a talk on Lewis Meacham, who was Hulbert's right-hand man, and he made the mistake of umpiring one game in his career, and he did an awful job, and he was hooted and hollered at by both people, by both the White Stockings and it was the St. Louis.
By that time, you had people were paying to get into the
That's right.
game, and
Mhm.
they had a rooters interest. That they had moved from the social club era to the, as the book is trying to say, trying to move you into the playing for keeps era.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Okay. One thing that Goldsmith spends an awful lot of time on, and I didn't really, I follow all this too well. He keeps stressing the whole manliness and boyishness of baseball, and he said, no single word carried more virtue or praise than manly, and few words carried as much disdain as boyish. And he mentioned the fly rule. Until the season of 1865, a batter was out if a fielder caught the batted ball fair or foul, either before it touched the ground or after the first bounce. And opponents of this style of playing favored a rule change specifying the batter was out only if they caught it on the fly, and it was more manly to catch it on the fly rather than to catch it on the first bounce. And again, on all the contemporary accounts that I read, I don't recall ever. In fact, I even went to newspapers.com and looked under manly and boyish, and baseball. I didn't see much at all. Did anybody else come across all this? I do know in all my research, I see where Buck Spalding, when he had with the White Sox, or Cap Anson with the White Sox, they divide teams up by the married people or the veterans or the rookies or married and singles. I saw that quite a bit with the divided up teams, but nowhere did I ever see manly or boyishness used.
I saw manly used by Henry Chadwick a lot.
Oh, really? He did? Yeah. Okay.
Particularly with the fly game.
Yeah.
Discussion.
This
But
guy
he would
game,
also
yeah.
have other rules that he would suggest, some of which were passed and some weren't passed. But
Yeah.
he would, in his words, I think you said, I want to try and increase the skill level.
Yeah.
Of the game, and then that's what the fly rule was to do.
Right.
And he called it manly. I don't know whether that was to differentiate it from sandlot games, or if it was just his way of saying it's the grown-up way.
So I just want to throw this out. I've been playing vintage baseball for 14 years
I
now,
know, Paul.
and
Yeah.
it's always been, it's manly. It's manly. They went to this because it was manly. And there's a myriad of insults that we use, and the main one is milk boy. If you catch a ball on a bound, you're a milk boy. So, and you're yelling at it. I think what's funny, and we're all adults here. So I actually called one of my buddies and I read the passage to him when he was talking about I'm going to read this. In the sexual economy of the game, in which adult male sublimated sexuality was contrasted with the boys' masturbatory practices, manliness at the plate, fine hitting deserved a manly response in the field, catching on the fly. So I told my buddy that the next time he catches it on the bound, I'm going to not call him a milk boy. I'm going to call him something else.
Yeah.
But I love that. That was like, I didn't finish the book, but that was, I read that chapter and reread it because I love that, just how that came about for something that I play so often. And just, I don't know, for me, it was always presented as it's manly. It's not manly to do this. So, but anyway, just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I thought a good point he made in the book. He described like a situation of somebody, hitting a really dynamic fly ball, or a long drive, and then and the fielder chasing after it, and then suddenly stopping to allow it to hit the ground for the bounce. And he talked about like the kind of the letdown that was, in a sense. of not being able to see the guy, get the ball on a fly, or attempt to get the ball on a fly. He just would, here's a dynamic shot, here's a guy chasing after the ball, and then stopping to let it bounce.
Two thoughts on that real quick, Peter. I thought it was interesting that he said, I think he quoted Chadwick, where he said, it's much more manly to catch it on the fly because then you get an extra try at it if you drop it, which is not always easy. But the other thing I thought was interesting, and he really didn't mention this, is that playing vintage baseball, and again, I mean, vintage baseball is vintage baseball, but there's sometimes where it's one of the things that really stood out to me is he's like, it's more important to play manly than to win the game. So one of my biggest peeves when I'm playing vintage ball is that you see the guy who's like going back to take it like this, you got two men out and he drops it. And I'm like, if you just catch him the bound, we would have been out of the inning. The other thing that's interesting to me is sometimes when you play vintage ball, and I kind of wish Matt was here too, because I think he plays vintage, but sometimes when you play vintage ball, you're thinking about what you're going to do. So if I catch it on the bound, for example, the force out is off. So you have to tag somebody. So sometimes you're like, well, if I catch this, I can actually do this play next, which I thought was an interesting, in my mindset, he didn't really mention. So for the record, but anyway, sorry to throw that out there. Like I said, just my vintage experience. I love that chapter. So I played for almost 15 years. So for me, that was like really cool.
Speaking of manly, Paul, I did a podcast yesterday for a guy, and we were talking about again, it was all on Spalding, and he was talking about when Spalding first used a glove. It was 1877. Do you use gloves, or is it all bare hand?
All bare hands.
Yeah, that's what I
So
figured.
the other thing that's funny, just to throw it out there real quick, was talking to, I mentioned this in my work, and they're like, going on the DL, and not being injured versus using a glove and not being injured. So I said I prefer to use the bound rule because I also have a day job and I type, so I can't break my hand, so it is what it is. But yeah, we don't use gloves. I always love to, when newbies show up, they're like, okay, I'm going to step out with my glove. I'm like, you can leave that right there. Or you get some guy who's like a bigger, tough guy, and he's like, I'm going to come out and play. And I'm like, yep, all right, here, let me throw this at you. What are you doing? Well, anyway, I didn't mean to digress. I apologize.
No, I like hearing about it. Yeah.
Yeah, Goldstein takes the time. I just want to say Goldstein takes the time to talk about the Knickerbockers being really the great advocate of the fly game. And as early as 1857, I mean, that's the beginning of the end. That's the year, let's say, Doc Adams wrote the rules of baseball, and it's a year before the actual Natural Association of Baseball Players is created. There before that, arguing for a more manly game, in a sense, by instituting the fly rule. And it took quite a few years to finally get the agreement of enough teams to play it that way.
I talk a little bit of my questions about the salaries, and Goldstein talks about salaries, but they're all going, not salaries, well, yeah, the money that is earned going to salaries, but only for salaries and not for the upkeep of the fields and the building. And I know we've talked about this before, that the money just wasn't going for salaries, but it was going for, again, upkeep, the fields, etc. And I just wanted to corroborate that with you all. But then a friend of mine is the grandson of the Wolverine player Sam Thompson. His name's Keith Thompson, and I asked him about this, and he says he owns the early Detroit Wolverine ledgers, and he says that they have detailed entries for every single expense, transaction expense, from salaries to paper clips to a line for income from shared revenue and everything else. So I think I've answered my own question, that the money I think Goldstein implies that it just went for salaries, but it went for other things besides salaries, what I'm getting
I want
at.
to I want to throw something out there real quick for you, Jack, which I thought was interesting. He made a point in here about fining players and how he thought it was just more of a, haha, don't do that, slap yourself on the wrist. But talking about ledgers, so I actually have access to the Buffalo Niagara's ledgers from the
Wow.
1857 through
Yeah.
1860 season.
Mhm.
What I think is interesting about that, and I have their ledger book, and there's actually notes in there where it actually literally lists out things like 25 cents, 10 cents, 5 cents. So I wonder if, maybe he glossed over it, but maybe this was something that they actually kept track of in their
Mhm.
ledgers where these fines were levied, so to speak.
Yeah.
The
Mhm.
ledgers as a whole are amazing.
Yeah.
I love, loan ball to Canadian team for $1.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting too.
Yeah. Mhm. I think he talks a lot, both he and Peter Morris talked about giving away the prize ball at the end of the game or end of the season. They'd be lacquered up and all finely written and everything. I've never seen a picture of one of those. Probably John Thorne might have one online, but I mean, or some display. I think I saw an article one time that a display case in one historical society, small town historical society, has one of those game balls on display.
When you
I
go
think-
to sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying there's photos of either the Eckforts or the Atlantics
Oh yeah.
trophy cases that just filled with
Really?
balls that
Oh,
are
yeah?
inscribed,
Yeah, inscribed, right.
painted,
Yeah.
painted on there.
Yeah.
And there was a controversy 1880-ish or something because the Atlantics were getting ready to go out of business and everybody was trying to figure out who owns the balls.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Don't forget too, when we go to SABR next year, go in the early game exhibit, the 19th century exhibit, and there's actually several trophy balls in there, and there's actually one of the fashion course race course balls is in there too.
Oh,
So you
yeah.
can check that out. That's actually pretty cool to see.
Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Goldstein talks about how baseball became more popular, the crowds grew larger, the crowds grew more boisterous, and I guess reporters worried about all the effects these spectators would have on the experience of the game. And he says it's the fear of uncontrolled conflict dominated the accounts of the big games, especially those in which the disturbances did take place. And again, I've read quite a few, maybe I just didn't notice this, but have you all noticed accounts from reporters worried about the spectator? I guess they might be worried about rowdyism in general, but I haven't really seen too many accounts of reporters writing in their game day accounts about people's behavior, I guess,
I think that's right. I think it was occasional. You would see it, but it
Yeah.
wouldn't be sort of a constant drumbeat in the background.
Yeah. I know. I think he talks about how social respectability, and he was worried about. Well, I guess that's why they wanted women too. They were more social respectability, and they were worried that the rowdiness would draw people away. Yeah.
But Chadwick wrote often about gamblers, and
Yeah.
and in the idea of the morality of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had a question. I wondered if anybody ever has actually tried to do, well, I guess you couldn't do a scientific research, but try to figure out if the rowdiness of a team led to poor attendance. My feeling was, in all the stuff I read, that, yeah, people didn't like it. Chadwick certainly didn't like it when people were rowdy, but I never saw anything to indicate that after a rowdy game, people dropped off. There were only, instead of having 10,000 people there were 2. And I just wonder if anybody knows of any research being done on that. Might be too hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know of anything.
Along with Jerry's thought there, the Haymakers were one of the most rowdy teams and rough teams, and they lasted for an awful lot of years, and they were in a small town, part of a small town, and I think that it's a good question. What we don't like today, what will stop fans from coming to the ballpark? A losing team. They don't care how they win, but if they win, they'll keep coming.
Yeah. Okay, Goldstein goes on about how more than any other game, baseball was built on a whole sense of localism, pride in your team, pride in your uniform, pride in and everything local, but definitely a competition and almost a sheer hatred toward other places, other localities, and other teams. But then he says earlier about how players went uneasy about playing other teams because they didn't want to offend them. They talked about the ill feelings and the rents in the social fabric. In fact, some clubs even chose not to pursue match victories because they didn't want to embarrass people, I guess. And he argues that the post-game dinners and the celebration and the entertainment, which we all know went on all the time, was an attempt to repair the rents in the social fabric and to rejoin the members of the fraternity who had been aligned against each other. So first off, he talks about localism, meaning you root for your team, but there's also this dislike for the other guy, so to speak. And did anybody have any thoughts about all that? I mean, I think Peter Morris was more in line with what I was just saying about how all for one and one for all. We play to win, of course, but at the same time, it's all the spirit of comradeship as well.
Well, as a sociological treatise, he was trying to prove a point. And he was making arguments that, at least in this particular case, I think were largely unfounded. The clubs behaved as clubs during the years that they were clubs. As we moved into having more established teams, they became competitors. And I don't think sitting back after the fact and saying, well, they were uncomfortable competing, probably advances the ball much. I think they might have been uncomfortable during those early years when they were just clubs, but I don't think that lasted very long.
Yeah. I think you can really see it though as you go from the 60s to the 80s, where you look at something like the 1860s, 50s, and 60s, like we're talking here, where it's a gentleman's game. You just go back to that gentleman's game. You go to, was he out? Was he safe? There's one umpire. It's it's whatever it is. And then you go to the 1880s and you talk about more of the rough and tumble, beer and whiskey league. You talk about guys cutting bases. You talk about these other things. And, there's a fine line, it talks, what are we? Are we manly? Are we going to, are we gentlemen and are we manly? And is it more about winning or is it more, is it about getting a good show, or is it more about a chowder supper, or is it more about winning the game? And as the game evolved, it's more about winning the game, and that competitiveness and really, to me, just really took off. So I think that's where you have that, whereas like, okay, we had a good match today, but in the 1880s, it wasn't necessarily the case.
Right. But in the 1850s and 60s too, we still had the influence of cricket.
Yeah, true.
And cricket was a real gentleman's game. Still is, frankly.
Hey, Jerry, let me ask you a quick question if I can. So do you think it was because of cricket, or do you think it was because of the society? Like the gentleman, the gentleman scholar, the Victorian motive, Victorian morals?
I thought it was more, I mean, it's sort of a combination, but I thought the cricket influence in those early years was really pretty important. I know a lot of the writing suggests that, the whole idea was to throw over cricket, get rid of the British game, get the American game going. But I think it was an evolution. And I think in those early years, a lot of these teams had cricket teams aligned with them, if they weren't playing cricket as well. So, and that's a very different pace, very different way of playing.
I just found, I was scrolling through my notes for the 1850s and 60s locally, Boston and Worcester area. And when you brought up cricket, it just jumped out at me. September 29, 1860, baseball match for $1,000. The test game of ball. And they use that actual word, it's the only time I think that I have found it, but test game, coming right from cricket. And
Didn't cricket pay their players like in the 1700s? They had,
I think
they
so,
had
yeah.
professionals. They still had the British Reserve and gentlemen did it,
yeah.
but they were the professionals. Look, that's what the Wrights did in New York. They played for the St. George Cricket Club and they got paid.
Well, this was the baseball game for $1,000, by the way, which was money put up by an industrialist. My question on this was, who got the $1,000? Did they split it up amongst the players, or did they leave it at the club money? This was the game that was unfinished in 1860. It was supposed to go to 100 tallies, and they only got as far as 50 tallies, and then the lease on the agricultural grounds ran out. And so they said, hey, we'll finish it next year. Well, you know what happened next year. But yeah, I thought that was interesting using, I mean, you did see it all the time using cricket terms throughout the early baseball games. And a lot of times they'll play, one game of cricket and one game of baseball. And they go back and forth, they would trade off. Especially a few British teams came through Boston at about that same time as well.
And although there was paid professional cricketers back in the 1700s, there was a very, very large club, situation throughout that period. Every town had their own club.
Yeah,
a lot of the towns had multiple clubs. They played each other in friendly matches. So it was, they had the professionals, but they also had a very vibrant amateur thing running alongside it.
Oh yeah, there was cricket being played in and around Boston at that time. Yeah, and I mean, I'm looking at one right now from 1860, but this is about, a very interesting match of cricket played on the ground at the New York Cricket Club at Hoboken on Monday, between 11 baseball players and 11 cricketers. The match will consist of one innings at cricket and one of baseball, with the players equally divided on each side. I thought that's kind of interesting. I wonder how that played out. I don't have a score, but that's and I saw that occurring in a few instances in Boston as well. The same thing, back and forth, back and forth. It's kind of neat.
Do you think it could also be something to do with the fact that, obviously all these teams, they came from something, they came from, a lot of these were they were firefighters. So you have this team as a firefighter, this team is a firefighter. Well, you're playing on the diamond together. Maybe, it's a hard fought game, but the next day you're putting out a fire together. So you're not going to want to, these are your brothers that are putting out fires or whatever it is. So you've got that camaraderie, I think, that way too.
Well, in both senses, it's a team.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
On each one, and you learn how to be a team, say on, with the fire company, and then you know how to come together as a team on a playing field.
How does that compare to today with the salaries and the publicity of the players and the way they're held higher than the sky and so forth?
Sure.
And they don't go to work tomorrow morning and put out a fire with somebody else. They go to work and earn their $30 million or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they want to earn 35 because 30 isn't enough. And I think I've been listening to this and it's been really interesting, but I keep thinking about people today versus people back in 1850. That was 150 years ago. And I think that the average person walking down the street today carries a different demeanor about them then the average person maybe, I wasn't there then, but maybe carries a different demeanor than the average person walking down the street 150 years ago. I play in I live in Southern Utah, and I played ball all my life, and I set up a baseball league for men and women in Rhode Island Senior Men's and Women's Baseball League. And we started with 4 teams. And when I moved to Utah, we had 85 teams. And so the game itself was very popular. But I will tell you that in the softball games that are here, it's slow pitch softball with adjusted rules with, there was one guy playing today who was 84. And there is still, and you umpire your own game. And so when your team's at bat, your team supplies the umpire. You have one umpire for the field. And last week, 3 guys got suspended for fighting after a game.
Oh, no.
I mean, what? And the funny thing, I wasn't at the game. I couldn't make it that day. And when they told me that 3 guys got suspended, I gave them the names of the 3 guys, and I was right on every one of them. Because it was the personality. It wasn't, just a thought.
I think it's just competitiveness. I mean, with vintage baseball, we've suspended a guy for 5 games.
Yeah.
Literally suspended a game. By the way, we also have an old player. Ours is 87. Plays 87, plays vintage ball. That's
Good.
insane.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. Couple things. Here's something I do know something about. Goldsmith talks about the pride in the choice of uniforms, and that uniforms help legitimate the game that these men were playing by referring visually to the ritual dress of other manly fraternal organizations such as fire companies and volunteer military companies. And he said that Chadwick believed that the club should not change their uniforms and have the same uniform stood for club continuity, the same about having the same club name, etc. He says, quote, changes in uniforms have often produced commotion in the baseball world. Now, in all my white stocking research, I've come across almost year by year when they decide to add something else to a uniform. I think it was Spalding's wife designed the uniforms one year, and I've never seen anything negative about changing the uniforms. Does anybody else? Because I know I've seen it many times with the white stockings, and I haven't seen anything negative about it.
The only thing I can think of is when they decided, it was the American Association decided to have them buy uniforms by players. Where they had the different colors, or it was like the first baseman wore this, and then the second baseman wore this color. So it's the only thing I could think of for it was a resounding negative. Why are we doing this? So,
yeah. And yet, if to me, I could well be wrong in this, but never has there been a year in Major League Baseball where there have been more different uniforms displayed on a given team than. I mean, it used to be a home and away, and this year, I don't know, what is every team have 10 different uniforms that they wear?
No, there's one team that has 2, and that's the Yankees. They won't change.
Okay. Well, a lot of that is a commercialism because of the huge market of buying jackets and hats and shirts and all that from your favorite team.
Yeah. Okay, I've just got 2 more things here, and again, here's something I have a decided opinion on as well. He talked about how baseball directors and owners treated their employees as employees, and they viewed themselves as benevolent baseball fathers rather than sensible businessmen and strict disciplinarians. And I gotta go back to like Spalding and the White Stockings, where he hired Pinkerton detectives to follow them to see if they weren't drinking, and there ain't any benevolency whatsoever, and you find them and everything, and that was more the norm, wasn't it, back then? They had a business to run, had strict discipline, and then there was nothing benevolent about it all, I don't think.
Well, I think a lot of it was affected by Harry Wright, in a sense, that point, that kind of paternal leader.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
you know, and I think that Harry Wright had such prominence in the game, particularly, you know, with his success with the Red Stockings, that they began to really consider what a manager really meant. You know, what was real leadership about? And I think that that was, you know, became somewhat of a theme. It's at least a theme of Goldstein's. You know, when he was writing, because he went into great detail about Harry Wright's style of managing. And Paul, you did our first novel. Uh, how quick I forget. This is my
If I never get back.
Yeah,
if I never
yeah.
get back, how can I forget that? and, um, that all bears true when you look at that novel. You ought to spend such time talking about Wright's leadership style, and you know, this whole, you know, kind of parental thing, and you know, really, and it comes true in this book also.
Yeah, I guess, you know, sort of my only quibble was the fact that he was trying to talk about the transition from the clubs to the professionals. And yes, Harry Wright was an important one. He was like the only one who exhibited all these traits. It wasn't like it took the world by storm in a year. And that's the way it's conveyed in the book, is more like, this is what happened with everybody, but he only talks about Harry because that's where it was.
Right. Yeah, there was certainly plenty of poor leaders.
When I saw the reference to the businessmen portraying themselves as benevolent baseball fathers, the flip side is the quote, sons, the players, have a duty obligation to the team. And then that would then translate into a willingness to accept less money. My guess is that's what was underlying any benevolent fatherhood.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Money on salary.
Money. Yeah. Back to your book, Paul. Those were my two favorite discussions were on those novels. I thought we had a good time talking about all those. I thought, yeah. But anyway, one last thing, and this really intrigued me too. On his introduction, he asked, "quote When will baseball acquire the density of the best American cultural history?" And I think we have in the last 20 years or so and everything. He wrote this book in 1989, and as we mentioned at the beginning, it was just starting out. I think we've come you know, like the old Virginia Slims commercial, we've come a long way, baby. So since then, there's been some really classic books.
Well, yes, we have come a long way, and there's so many more things that we know that we didn't know 20 years ago, for sure. But I think he captured, and he says it in his epilogue. I think he did capture that this was a dynamic period of baseball going from a club with socials and, you know, discussions about manly or unmanly or boyish. And then by the time 15 or less than 20 years pass, you have the first professional league. You know, you have the formation of the National Association. And it's a tremendously dynamic time. And you know, I thought he managed to capture that in his telling of this period, this telling of the, you know, the changes to the game and the things that, you know, I didn't always agree with particularly everything he said about what drove this or drove that, but it did happen. And, you know, by 1871, when they're sitting there in 13th Street and 3rd Avenue, making up the on St. Patrick's Day, making up the rules and the guidance for the National Association, and that's another topic we'll get into at the Fred with a panel discussion this year about that. But it's kind of interesting that I thought he captured it. I thought he made it happen. And I find this particularly very interesting because my own background was in my personal life, I was in the NYPD, for some of you don't know that, but I taught, I frequently taught at the police academies when sergeants were getting promoted. For, first time that a sergeant would be, a cop would become a sergeant and be responsible for other cops. And I used to tell a story about how I was supervising some detectives, and we had a guy wanted for a double homicide. And one guy in the squad knew where this guy was, where this murder suspect was. But he wouldn't tell this other guy because this other guy had cut his grass, more to say, by barging into a conversation with a girl at a bar that they went to after, your tour of duty. So it became, when I used to tell that story to these new sergeants, they couldn't believe it. I said, well, I mean, that's group dynamics. It's work, it's work goals versus, what do you call it? I had a term for it. Work goals versus group life. And there was a dynamic there. It was group life, took precedent over work goals. Let's lock up this guy for these murders. We finally did do it. But that was a dynamic. And, I could see that throughout the reading this history. It was oftentimes work life versus group goal, group life versus work goals. Anyway.
Well, 9 o'clock, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Jack,
Jack.
you're becoming
Thanks, everybody.
wonderful job.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Thank you
enjoyed it
very
a lot. I enjoyed it quite
Thank
a
you
bit.
very much.
Yeah. Thanks for all your
You were the anchor,
contributions
you were the
too.
anchor of our summer.
Thank you.
I just
Yeah.
want to mention there's somebody here on our screen tonight that Andy Cherrick was one of the two people that received the co-chairs award for the 19th Century Committee. Andy became a major contributor and moderator of our Facebook page. And thank you very much, Andy. And your replica 1880s Burlingame model bat is on its way to you soon.
Hey, thanks. And yeah, if anybody hasn't joined yet, if you're on Facebook, just find one of us and we can get you in there.
Thank you so much. All right, I just want to say a couple of things quickly. I sent out a little what I call the 19th Century Committee telegram today. And it basically just wanted to say, because we're 6 weeks, Bob has done such a tremendous job with our newsletter for so long. But what's happening is the committee's activities are growing. And so we're 6 weeks to the next newsletter, even though they come out in a very timely way. We are still 6 weeks. So the very next thing that's going to happen is our next book to be discussed will be discussed on actually November the 19th. So if your calendars originally marked the 12th, it was changed 1 week. So it does have a new date. September the 19th will be Matt Albertson discussing Outside the Lines of Gilded Age Baseball. This is book number 3 of a series of 4 books. And then in very rapid succession, Paul will be back sometime in October, and he'll be talking about the summer of beer and whiskey. Ed Acorn's very excellent book on that summer of the creating the American Association and so forth. And in November, we have somebody else here. Where did I lose you? Oh, there he is, Larry Drake. Is going to be doing. He really tackled something big. He tackled John Thorne's Baseball in the Garden of Eden, which will
do
be
my darndest.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm going to do my darndest.
I'm sure you'll do okay. And then again, Men Albertson will be back with book 4 of the Gilded Age series, the final book in that 4-book series. The book 3 is about the lead up to the Players League, and book 4 is the Players League, about the Players League and the finances. And Bob, anything else?
Way to go.
No, we've got been nice to, after taking July off, to get back into the discussion. It was a good time. Thank you, Jack. And we look forward to seeing you also. The second Tuesday in September next month is the speaker series with Bill Felber. Bill was the editor of Inventing Baseball, and he has a number of stories from, I think it's 1897, with some colorful players of the era.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. If we don't see you at the speaker series, we'll see you at the next book discussion. And Jack, thank you again.
Thanks, everybody. Thank
really
you.
good
Thank you,
book.
Jack.
Thanks,
Good night,
everybody.
all.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
The Yankees lost 12-2 to the White
Yeah,
Sox.
yeah. Yesterday, they're ahead 2-0
it's
right
2-0 right now. God, see you guys.
You never know.
Yeah, right. That's why they play the game. Have a good night.